From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Hanratty, Director for Human Resources at the Library of Congress, and I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's presentation, which is co-sponsored by the library's Employee Assistance Program and the library's Science, Technology, and Business Division. And I appreciate Susan Diamond of the Employee Assistance Program and Tomoko Steam of the Science, Technology, and Business Division for their efforts in pulling this presentation together. Our presenter today is William Cope Moyers, who will discuss his book, Broken, A Story of Addiction and Redemption. And Mr. Moyers' book will be available for purchase at the conclusion of the presentation, and he will also be available to sign the books. Mr. Moyers is Vice President of Foundation Relations for Hazelden, one of the world's largest private, not-for-profit alcohol and drug addiction treatment centers. And in this role, Mr. Moyers draws upon his personal experiences to highlight the power of addiction and the power of recovery. In 1998, the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence awarded Mr. Moyers and his family its highest achievement award, the Gold Key. And before joining Hazelden in 1996, Mr. Moyers was an award-winning journalist for 15 years. You will have an opportunity at the conclusion of Mr. Moyers' presentation to ask questions, and we will be videotaping the presentation. So we may include some of your questions in that presentation. So without further ado, please welcome William Cope Moyers.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you too to Susan Diamond and the staff here at the Library of Congress for making it possible for me to be here today, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules, and I know everybody's got a busy schedule these days, to listen and to talk and to share some community experience around an issue that we don't talk too much about in the public, addiction treatment and recovery. I'm honored to be here at the Library of Congress and to talk about my book, Broken. This is an esteemed place. It is hallowed ground, the largest library in the world. Wow, pretty impressive. A pillar of our nation's cultural history. A place that I've never been, even though I've been invited to speak in places all over the country, in venues big and small. I've never had an opportunity to be at the Library of Congress, and so I'm really honored, genuinely honored, and a bit humbled to be with you all today here at the Library of Congress. Not just to be in an esteemed place, but to be with an esteemed audience of people who really want to talk about an issue that we don't like to talk about too much, and also to be among some of my colleagues who have been so important to me over the years and so important to my work at the Hazelden Foundation. I think Pablo McCabe is here. Is Pablo here? Where are you? Pablo McCabe is Hazelden's sort of man on the ground, if you will, based in New York. Did you take the train or did you drive?
No, took the train.
Took the train down today, Pablo. Pablo came down from New York just to be here, in part because Pablo knows everything. And if you have any questions about Hazelden products and services or anything that we do, or anything that you can't field in terms of the questions you'll have with me, anything you need to ask Pablo or follow up with Pablo, he's always around and available, and as I said, knows a lot more than I do. So thank you, Pablo, for being here today. Also, we have at least one of the Hazelden Board of Trustee members here, Mary Farnham Whitney. Where is Mary? There's Mary. Mary, thanks a lot. Mary is a dear old friend of mine personally. She and her husband, the former ambassador to Norway, Ambassador Ben Whitney, are back from their service overseas and living here in the Washington, D.C. area. And thank you, Mary, for your service, your friendship over all the years, for being here today. And also one of my colleagues, Carol McDade. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Carol later. Where did Carol go? Oh, there she is. Carol McDade is in charge of Hazelden's government relations. She was with Capital Decisions here in Washington, and Carol has been a tireless advocate for exactly the issues that are so personal to me and so important to my policy work. So thank you, Carol. I don't know if any other Hazelden board members made it over here today, but thank you all for being here. So I'm honored to be here in this hallowed place, and I'm with an esteemed group of people, but I have to admit I'm a bit surprised as well. Because you see, I was here exactly 4 years ago this week on the second stop of the first book tour for my book, Broken, My Story of Addiction and Redemption. It was exactly 4 years ago this week that I made my second stop at the Smithsonian Institute in a presentation that was taped by C-SPAN and just keeps running over and over and over again. And in this case, I'm not complaining. But I was a little intrigued when Susan and the staff invited me to come and share a book that is now 4 years old. I mean, a lot has happened in 4 years. If you really think about it, a Republican was in the White House back then. And a little-known senator named Barack Obama was a little-known senator from Illinois. Jason Campbell was a starting quarterback of the Washington Redskins. Donovan McNabb played up the coast for a big rival. What does this group want this weekend? Skins? Yeah, it's going to be a good game. The stock market was about 12,000, and while that wasn't necessarily spectacular or depressing, it was relatively stable. Lots happened in those 4 years. Companies like Citibank and AIG were seen as impregnable international powerhouses that said to the federal government, stay away. Now we own them. 4 years ago, Tiger Woods was a role model. And British Petroleum was not considered a leading ingredient in the water called the Gulf of Mexico. A lot has changed in the last 4 years. A lot has changed in our lives. A lot has changed in my life. Not just in America, but as I said, in my own life as well. In fact, I'm at the point now where I think I need to write another book called Beyond Broken, the rest of the story. But even though a lot has changed in our country in the last 4 years, even though a lot has changed in my personal life, what I always hold on to, what hasn't changed, what has remained a constant in my life, is what happened to me on the morning of October the 12th of 1994. That hasn't changed at all. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of this time today sharing what happened to you on the moment that changed my whole life, the morning of October the 12th of 1994. And this is from the prologue of my first book, Broken. There was a sharp rap on the door, followed by a muffled but unmistakable command from a voice outside in the hallway. We want the white guy, just the white guy. We know he's in there. He comes out now and there's no trouble for anyone later. I was the white guy. And in that instant, I knew that my family's desperate search to track me down had ended at this decayed two-story apartment in a violent pocket of Atlanta's inner city. Terrified, I rushed around the room, trying to warn the other crackheads to sit still and keep quiet. Don't panic, I whispered. They'll go away. But nobody was listening because everybody was as high and as scared as I was. We bumped into one another as we tried to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. We were like wild animals trapped by a wind-whipped forest fire. Who was out there banging on the door? Was it my father, my mother, my wife? My mind flashed back to that morning 4 days earlier, October the 8th of 1994, 4 days earlier when I left my house in suburban Atlanta. I remember kissing 4-month-old Thomas and 2-year-old Henry goodbye. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I told my wife, Allison, that I needed to run some errands before dinner. I drove to the parking lot on the corner of Boulevard and Ponce de Leon Avenues, approached a drug dealer with a thick scar running from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth, and paid him $100 for 6 marble-sized rocks of crack cocaine. I held them in my hand and thought, these will keep me going for a day or two. They were gone in 4 hours. The knocking now became a relentless pounding that shook the door frame. I thought about escaping out the back porch to the vacant lot and just running. But where could I go? They would find me, just like they had found me in Harlem and in St. Paul. I've been running for 5 years, And now I had run out of options. And so on the morning of October the 12th of 1994, in a full-blown relapse from my chronic disease of addiction to alcohol and other drugs, tired of running, but scared to death to give up, I did what any good addict and alcoholic does when the gig is up. What did I do? I got high one more time. And when I took that last hit of crack cocaine, up I went, and then down I plunged like that, because not even the drugs and the alcohol were working anymore. For years I had been pushing away the truth. For years I had been surrounding myself in denial, hoping against all hope that somehow I could get on top of my cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient problem, the disease of addiction. But not even the drugs and the alcohol were working anymore. And so I took that last hit of crack cocaine in the morning of October the 12th of 1994, and away I went, and down I came. And then this is what happened. I folded my arms over my chest, longing for comfort and for peace. I was so sick and tired of it all. And in that moment, I realized the hopelessness. Of my situation. And in a sudden, brief flash of clarity, I asked myself this question. Now what? Now what? I stared at the filthy wood floor littered with half-empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and used syringes. The answer to that simple question, now what? The answer wasn't here in this room anymore. It was all over. I was done. And so on that morning of October the 12th of 1994, up off the floor of that crack house in the inner city of Atlanta, Georgia, one of the most violent places in the country, up off the floor of that crack house I came through no power of my own. It couldn't have been. Although I clearly remember getting up off that floor and watching my legs do the moving. I would do it right now, except I'm tethered here pretty intently. And I walked past all those other hopeless and helpless addicts who were no different than me except for two things. One was the color of their skin. It was different than my color. And the only other difference between all those other people and me was that I was going to get one more chance. And I walked past all those other people who I can clearly remember in my mind's eye, just as clearly as I'm looking at each and every one of you out there today, most of whom are now dead if they're not in prison. I walked past all those other people who were exactly like me except for those two key factors. And I opened that door that people were banging on. And there were two deputy sheriffs from the Fulton County Sheriff's Department who'd been sent there not to arrest me, necessarily, but to hold me accountable by steering me towards treatment. And they took me firmly, yet humanely, in their arms, and they guided me out to a van that was conveniently parked on the sidewalk in front of the crack house for me. It was part of an intervention. And then this is what happened in that last moment. A hard, steady rain was falling as we approached the gray van parked on the curb. The sliding door opened and I collapsed into the back seat. My father was sitting in the front passenger seat. Turning around to look at me, he saw a 35-year-old crack addict who hadn't shaved, showered, or eaten in 4 days. A man who had walked out on his wife and 2 young children and ditched his promising career as a journalist at CNN. A broken shell of a man, a pale shadow of the human being that he had raised to be honest, loving, and responsible. His firstborn son. Silence. You're angry, I said. It wasn't funny back then. You're angry, I said. I didn't know what else to say. That's hardly the word for it, my father replied. His voice was harsh and cold, like the rain outside. More silence. There's nothing else I can do for you, my father said. I'm finished. All these years later, my father tells me that's where the conversation ended. But whether I imagined it or not, I did not imagine it. I just gave my father the benefit of the doubt for the book. Whether I imagined it or not, I heard my father say something else to me on that morning of October the 12th of 1994. Said my father, "I hate you." And I remember looking into my father's eyes and speaking my deepest truth: I hate me too. The power of addiction, when it can cause a loving father to think in that moment of desperation that he hates his oldest son. The power of addiction, when it can cause a loving, honest, and good man, me, to think that I hate myself as well. Does anybody doubt the power of addiction in the lives of people like us? A disease that does not discriminate. A disease that does not matter if you're from the inner city of Washington, D.C. or the quiet suburbs of Long Island or Atlanta, Georgia, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, whether you're a Jew or Catholic or Muslim or of no faith, whether you work for the federal government or a billionaire in private practice, a disease that does not matter. A disease that is cunning and baffling and powerful and can cause a father to think he hates his son and a son to think he hates himself too. Go figure. I mean, as Carol McDade and some of my other colleagues, and I see Bill Lammers from the Hazelden board here. Thank you, Bill, for being here. As some of us know, I was raised with everything good. I lacked for nothing emotionally. I lacked for nothing morally. I lacked for nothing financially. And I lacked for nothing spiritually. This is a disease that does not matter what your morals are or what your faith is or what your financial background is. This disease does not care. I mean, because I had it all. I'm the product of two parents who loved me and continue to love me unconditionally. As I said, I lacked for nothing. Some of you may know my father, the journalist Bill Moyers. You know him as a journalist who's won a couple of Peabodys, some Pulitzers. He's won a lot of Emmys. You may know him as the journalist who's been at PBS for 30 years. He's retired again, but like Brett Favre, I'm sure he'll be back. You may know that before my father was a journalist, he was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary and chief of staff right across the road here. I have distinct memories of being in the White House, being on Air Force One, of hanging out in my father's office in the executive branch, executive offices there. I remember flying on Air Force One and getting on the helicopter on the South Lawn. I mean, I had it all. My father was a public servant who helped to set up the Peace Corps under John Kennedy in 1961. You may know those things about my father, but the other thing you may not know about my father, this is the trivia question, is what did my father do when I was born in 1959? He was an ordained Southern Baptist minister in Texas, and so I had it all. Even that piece up there. I did. I lacked for nothing. I tell you that because I had it all. I came from a good family with a strong background and was raised to be a resilient young man. Addiction does not discriminate. It does not care. But despite all the things I had in my life growing up, all the good things, I had two other things that were going on. Carol knows it, Bill knows it, Mary knows it. Some of us in this room know it. We can relate to it. We may call it something differently, but we can all relate to it in one way, shape, or form. I had two other things that were going on back then. One of them was I had a hole in my soul. Mine is right here. Now, I was told not to take off my jacket, otherwise I'm going to ruin the AV, but mine is right here. I got a hole in my soul. It's right underneath my rib cage, and like many of you, it aches with a sense of imperfection. It aches with a sense that I'm not good enough, that I need to be better than. Now, science hasn't found out if there's a genetic connection between addiction and this hole in the soul yet. And in fact, I think everybody in this room probably has that hole in the soul. It's what causes us all to yearn for more, to want to know more. I mean, I think we all have it. We want to aspire to greatness and to do things. No matter what we do, we want to do more. I have it too. But mine was all about a sense of not being good enough. And yeah, maybe some of it had to do with being associated with Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy and having a father who was successful. I'm sure that fed the hole in the soul, but there is no doubt in my mind that I was born with it. That's not why I'm addicted, but it's why I ingested mood and mind-altering substances to medicate this hole in the soul, because I got tired of trying to be a perfectionist all the time. So when you take a hole in the soul, which I think most human beings have, and you combine it with what science is telling us. Alan Leshner was one of your speakers recently, yes? He can say it better than I can. But when you combine a hole in the soul with what Alan Leshner and Dr. Nora Volkoff and others at NIDA and NIAAA are always talking about, which is the science of addiction, the origins, the genetic origins of addiction in the brain. See, I've got one of those brains. Don't run, it's going to be okay. I've got one of those brains that I don't know how I got it, although I have looked back now, and since we've been able to talk openly in our own family about addiction now, I have discovered that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, or the nut doesn't fall very far from the tree. Yeah, it was there. We just didn't talk about it. And when I smoked marijuana for the first time in 1976 as a teenager in the quiet suburbs of Long Island, it turned on a light switch in my brain which I could not turn off on my own. Now, that does not absolve me of responsibility, but it helps to explain why a good person like me does bad things. It helps to explain why a moral person like myself can do immoral things. It helps to explain why loving people do hateful things, reasonable people do irrational things. It's about this combined with this, and you get this. And from the moment I smoked marijuana for the first time, not because I wanted to medicate this, I discovered it was the solution, but it's not why I did it. I just smoked marijuana back in 1976, like Bill Clinton. Never mind, he didn't smoke it. No, he didn't inhale it, no. But when I smoked marijuana, it wasn't because I was looking for the answer. I did it because it's what I thought everybody did. I did it because I wanted to fit in just like our children and our grandchildren today, whether we live in Northern Virginia or in the inner city. It's what children are still doing because they just want to be teenagers and they like to take chances. I did it for that reason, but when I did it, it solved this and it turned on this and I was gone. No longer did I have to try to be such a perfectionist anymore. And besides, this thing was raging. And so I graduated from smoking marijuana to drinking beer at the legal age of 18 in 1977. My casual use of mood and mind-altering substances led to hard drug use when I was in college at Washington and Lee University in Southern Virginia, not too far from here. Actually, I think it's that way. Right? That's south. My casual use of those substances led to a full-blown addiction. Even though I was a successful journalist in Dallas in the 1980s and later in New York, I was very good at covering it up. We always are. We always are. We're resilient people, us addicts and alcoholics. We're resilient beyond the patience of those who love us even. And by the time I was 30 years old in 1989, I was a crack addict living in a crack house in Harlem, New York. I owned a house on the suburbs of Long Island, in the North Shore of Long Island, on the Long Island Sound. I owned a house, but I was homeless and I wandered the streets of Harlem, New York when I wasn't living in a crack house. That's how debilitating, potent, and omnipotent, actually. That's how powerful addiction is in the mind, the body, and the soul of an addict and an alcoholic like me. Again, that does not absolve me of responsibility. I willfully took that first drink. I willfully smoked marijuana. I willfully experimented with crack cocaine. I did all those things of my own free will. It's just that when I did those things, those mood and mind-altering substances hijacked my brain and stole my soul. And so in 1989, I hit bottom in a crack house in Harlem, New York. I was locked up in a psych ward for 3 weeks, and then I was shipped out to this place in the Midwest called Minnesota. I'd never been to Minnesota. I didn't even know what the capital of Minnesota was, but in the summer of 1989, in August of 89, after 3 weeks in a psych ward in New York City, I was locked in a psych ward not so much because I was crazy, and I don't use that term lightly. I just use that term to describe the fact that they didn't know what to do with me. I mean, here were Bill and Judith Moyers. They knew everything, right? And they loved their son, but they had something on their hands that they could not figure out. And they, like most parents, most employers, most grandparents, most spouses, most children, they did not know what to do with this son who was addicted. They barely even understood what it really meant to be addicted. And so 3 weeks in a psych ward, out to Minnesota. I went to Hazelden. I loved Hazelden so much that I decided to go back there for a second visit. And we can laugh about it now, but it wasn't funny when my father and my then girlfriend had to come and find me in a crack house in St. Paul, Minnesota. You see, because when I finally admitted that I was an addict and an alcoholic, I was looking not for a solution, I was looking for a cure. You know, I wanted to be cured. Give me surgery, give me meds, irradiate it, just cure me. I did not understand that the nature of my illness was not so much in my inability to put down the drugs and the alcohol as much as it was in my inability to live life on life's terms. And if you don't work a program, and I know there are lots of programs out there that work, mine happens to be one that's got steps in it. If you don't work a program in the absence of those mood and mind altering substances, suddenly what happens to people like us? We become restless, irritable, and discontent. And our own skin, in part because we're not medicating this anymore. This is craving. And if we don't work some program of recovery, whether it's church or the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous or rational recovery or whatever it is for those of you out there, if we don't replace the mood and mind altering substances with something else, then we're shortly there after, right back where we started from, or worse, somewhere lower, because this is a progressive illness. We never get better. Don't run out of the room. It's okay. I'm in remission. We never get better. We only get worse. I know I've got one more drink in me. I know I've got one more hit of crack on me. I know I've got no more recovery in me because my illness is chronic and it's progressive. And while I have been clean and sober for 16 years, if I pick up, I'll never get back. And so the only way for me to stay in remission is not by letting go. It's by taking responsibility for managing my chronic illness. And that means working on this and keeping this at bay. I did not understand that. I thought alcoholism was like a right arm or a left arm. It was part of me. I didn't know it was all of me. And so I went back to Hazelden for a tune-up in 1991. I stayed abstinent for 3 years. I say abstinent. That's a good thing to be abstinent, but I was not recovering the way that those of us understand. I have recovered from the desperate condition, but I continue to recover all these years later because science has not yet found the cure for addiction, though there's certainly a lot of pharmacological agents that are very helpful in the managing of the treatment and recovery process. Nevertheless, I am more alcoholic now than when I landed at the airport last night because of the progressive nature of my illness. That means I have to take responsibility. I took responsibility for my illness, but I did not understand that meant managing my recovery. So I was abstinent for 3 years in Atlanta in the early 1990s. And then on the morning of October the 12th of 1994, with this thing raging and this thing sucking me into the black hole of imperfection, I went back out, not to get high. I went back out on the morning of October the 8th of 1994 to die. Because I did not know how to live with drugs, and I did not know how to live without drugs. Had it not been for my loving wife, my committed parents, notwithstanding what my father said to me in that moment of utter fear that he had it not been for my family, my parents, my employer, CNN, who was like, you know what, you're a really valuable guy when you're sober. But you better get sober or you're going to lose your job. If it wasn't for my employer, my family, my spouse, my mentors in recovery, if it wasn't for the community that continued to love me, even when I was no longer capable of loving myself, if it hadn't been for that community, I wouldn't have made it. I would not have made it. Now, I might have gotten lucky and ended up living under a bridge. I might have gotten lucky and ended up in prison. I don't think that was even going to be an option for me. I got lucky because I got one more chance and didn't die. Because I will tell you today, if you don't know it already, there are only two outcomes for those of us who have addiction to alcohol or other drugs. One of them is to recover, and the other one is to die. It's a terminal illness. It may kill us this afternoon in a crack house in Northeast. It may kill us of cirrhosis of the liver 30 years from now. It may kill us in a drunk driving accident on I-95 next week. But the reality is that if people like me don't recover, we die. And oftentimes, it's not just ourselves that we take out, it's our innocent families, the motorists on the road, the community that we live in. And I got that chance. I got to go to treatment. Not once, not twice. I went to treatment 3 times, essentially over 5 years before I finally got it in October of 1994. And part of that, and I have to be careful here because I recognize the separation of church and state, but I got to tell you, my father was an ordained Southern Baptist minister when I was born in 1959 in Fort Worth, Texas. I told you, I understood that up there. I always had this fundamental belief, even though I had struggled with my faith for a long time. But when I finally on that morning of October the 12th could not answer that simple question, now what? Think about how easy that is, a question, now what? I mean, I'm a guy with a Bachelor of Arts in journalism and a good career in journalism, and I can't answer this fundamental question, now what? When I was stumped in that crack house to that question, now what? It was the first time in my life I realized that I did not have an answer to what ailed me. And in that moment of clarity of asking for now what, I had this other moment of clarity, which was recognizing that for me, it wasn't about believing in God. It was about trusting. Trusting in God, or higher power, or whatever you want to call it. Trusting that my HP could do for me what I could not do for myself. And in that moment, I surrendered. Now, surrender isn't about giving up. It's about giving in. If I had given up, I could have killed myself. That would have been easy. But I gave in and I said, okay, I'm done. Have me. And because of the support of the community, as I talked about earlier, and because I had some money in my pocket, and because I had good insurance. Yes, that's a laugh now. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Because I had all those things, I had all the resources that were needed to help this one addict and alcoholic take advantage of that one more chance, give in, accept responsibility, and say, now what? I'm done. Have me. And I've been clean and sober every day since the morning of October the 12th of 1994. So how does a guy like me get off the floor of a crack house, get sober, and end up working for a place like Hazelden? Well, that's another story. You'll have to read about it in the book. But I do believe that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. How do I explain my life otherwise? I mean, I am here despite a disease that wants me dead. I'm here working in the field of addictions treatment and policy despite my best laid plans. But I think the power of recovery, however you define it, and it doesn't have to be spectacular examples of it. It can be in the smallest appreciation of a sunset over the Capitol. It can be in hearing the cooing of a grandchild. It can be in anything you find pleasure, but for me, it happened beyond me, but I was there to absorb it. I can't even explain it. I'm speechless for the word right now. I know it's there, but I can't find it. But my goodness, I'm here despite everything that happened because I was opened and ready to be melded and molded and changed in every aspect of my being. Now, I am still a flawed human being. We'll get to that a little bit later. But I'm okay in my own skin, and I am open to the possibility and the enjoyment of anything that happens in my life, and it's how I got to Hazelden. I answered a classified ad in the newspaper. With less than a year and a half of sobriety, they took a chance on me and they hired me, and I began working there in 1996. And my first day on the job, the day I met Carol McDade for the first time, the CEO of Hazelden, Mary, I believe you were on the board back then or around that time, the CEO of Hazelden said, "William, we want you to go to Washington and change public policy." I said, "Sure, where's the money?" And they said, well, we're a not-for-profit. We don't have any money. I said, okay, well, we're the Legion of Advocates. And there's one raising his hand back there. One. And I looked over my shoulder, and as Winston Churchill said once, the scariest thing about being a leader is looking over your shoulder and seeing that nobody is following. And I charged off to Washington on February the 29th of 1996. It was a leap day. And I came to Washington to change public policy around addiction treatment and recovery issues. And we had no money, and we had no legions, and it was a very lonely fight. But 14 years later, as Carol and some of the others in this room know, we've made great strides. And so before I close and have questions and answers, I want to tell you that for the last 14 years, I worked in one way, shape, or form for the Hazelden Foundation as a public policy advocate to start, and now as the Vice President of Foundation Relations, meaning I do everything from public speaking to government relations to fundraising to alumni to media and all those things. Go figure. Go figure. Go figure. The power of recovery, go figure. But I want to close by reading a piece of the book that goes back to what we talked about at the beginning about what's happened since I wrote the book, what has changed and what hasn't changed. Some of you know it as better than I do in this room. But I'll read you something concluding from the book to bring us back to the beginning, and then we'll have some Q&A until about 4 o'clock. And this is from the chapter of my book called Cancer. I have to find it here, though. It's funny. I like doing this. I don't do this much anymore, but it's kind of nice. It's nice to go back to my roots and to read from this old book. and it helps actually to put into perspective, I will say. It puts into perspective, really how far we've come and how far we still have to go, personally and in our professional lives. This is from a chapter called Cancer, on page 344. The disease of addiction and the disease of cancer. I've been intimate with both. And my experiences help to frame my public advocacy work and inform every conversation I have and every issue I raise. In comparing the two illnesses, I ask and attempt to answer these questions, and I call these the 6 questions. Number 1, I think it's entirely appropriate for this group where we are today and in the shadow of across the street, the Capitol. Number 1, why do we continue to whisper? Why do we continue to whisper about addiction like earlier generations did about the long illness that too many people died from? Answer, because people who are addicted are too sick to know it, and those of us who have recovered are too ashamed to admit we ever had it. Question, why is addiction the only disease without a ribbon of hope to wear out in public? Answer, because it's noble to fight breast cancer and courageous to fight for the rights of people with HIV/AIDS. But the stigma of addiction, in many ways similar to the stigma of mental illness, envelops all those who are suffering, including family members, in secrecy, silence, and shame. Shame fosters stigma, and stigma promotes shame. And in the meantime, the tradition of anonymity in Alcoholics Anonymous often prevents people from standing up and speaking out. Somehow it still remains against the rules of 12-step anonymity to be seen or heard standing up for a cause like recovery. We hide behind our recovery. We hide behind our recovery. But did we worry about going out in public and making fools of ourselves when we were drunk or stoned? That behavior was a symbol of everything that was wrong with us then. What is the symbol of what is right with us now? We should take hope from the struggles and strides of people with diseases such as HIV/AIDS or mental illnesses. They've fought hard to improve public understanding and to change public policy around their illnesses, and they've been successful. We will be too. Question, why do so many people with addiction receive censure and punishment, which by themselves do nothing to solve the problem, rather than understanding and treatment, which do? Answer, because the myths and misperceptions about addiction tell us that addicts and alcoholics are somehow bad, lazy, self-centered, immoral, weak-willed. And being bad means breaking the law, and breaking the law means crime followed by punishment. Besides, the country would have to stop building more jail cells in favor of more treatment beds. And how many politicians are willing to risk the label soft on crime? And another question along these lines to ponder: why is it that people with cancer, diabetes, or hypertension are considered victims when their own behavior or lifestyle sometimes contributes to their illness, but we never attach the same sympathetic label to people with my disease? Question: why do most insurance companies refuse to pay for addictions treatment when they so generously cover expenses associated with other illnesses? Answer: because not enough people have called to complain. Imagine the outrage if insurance companies systematically denied women with breast cancer or children with congenital birth defects access to medical expertise they deserve to overcome their problems. I wonder, where is our outrage? And finally, why does society continue to spout the old line that treatment doesn't work when research shows that quality treatment is even more effective for addiction than it is for other chronic illnesses? Answer: because people like me don't stand up and speak out as often as we should, proving with our faces and with our voices that treatment does work and recovery is possible. Too many of us just want to be normal again. We don't want to talk about our past with people who may think less of us or somehow make our lives more difficult. We also take for granted that treatment options we had when we needed them will be there for the next generation. But there are not enough treatment programs available to help the people who need them. That is the bottom line. Treatment facilities are dying in America, and so too are the people who need them. Now, I wrote that in 2005. The book came out in 2006. And I end on a high note by telling you that not only do the Redskins have a new quarterback, but much of what I wrote about back in 2005 and 2006 actually has changed. And it's all good. For example, this is Recovery Month. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has got activities all over this country. Imagine the federal government sponsoring, supporting something that's all about celebrating the reality of my life, not my specific life, but the reality that my life is what it is because I have recovered, and that there are hundreds of thousands of people in small towns and big cities all over this country who have recovered, and that the federal government wants them to stand up and speak out in celebration. In fact, this Thursday night at the Twins' new outdoor stadium, we're going to have our Recovery Month rally, and Jim Ramstad, a former congressman, is going to throw out the first pitch. And there are going to be thousands of us wearing purple t-shirts that says Recovery Works in the stands. Now, my ego wants me to be down hitting a home run behind the plate, but progress, not perfection. So the federal government gets it, and they're promoting events all over the country. The Library of Congress gets it. Here I am. You get it. Here you are. So that's a good thing that's happened. And Yvette Torres and others at SAMHSA should get all the credit for what they're doing. NIDA and NIAAA doing what they're doing around brain research. It's really taking off now. Oh, there have been scientists and researchers looking at it, but I think in the last 5 years, science has made great strides in helping to understand this and explain this, and that's all good. 2 years ago, as you know, and because of the tireless work of Carol McDade at Capital Decisions, Congress passed parity. It was part of the bailout bill, but who noticed? Congress passed parity. President Bush signed it into law, and it's being implemented now by the Obama administration. What an incredible stride to get insurance companies to treat my illness like they cover other major illnesses. Now, the challenge is going to be to make sure that those who still really are got a big resentment about the passage of that law don't gut it. And Carol, it's your responsibility, and Hazelden's responsibility, Bill and Mary, Pablo. It's everybody's responsibility to make sure that not just the spirit exists, but that the teeth exist in the parity law, not just for federal employees, but for private citizens and big companies and independent policies as well. And healthcare reform also includes addictions treatment in its basic benefit package. Wow. Another thing that I think is really important to remember as I close here is that people are standing up and speaking out in an organized way, not just through the federal government's recognition of Recovery Month, but in Faces and Voices of Recovery. Is Pat Taylor here? She's not here. Does anybody know about Faces and Voices of Recovery? Carol does, and Carol will be here to speak. And what is your name, by the way?
My name is Susie Herbert.
Oh, Susie. And so how do you know about Faces and Voices?
I was a substance abuse administrator in Pennsylvania and local government for 25 years. And we worked really hard to bring the recovery movement into our community and worked a little bit with the federal Office of Faces and Voices.
So Faces and Voices of Recovery is a 501c3 that's right here in Washington, D.C. Carol, what's the address? It's on
1101 Vermont Avenue.
1101 Vermont Avenue, facesandvoicesofrecovery.org, and it's an organization that sprung up in part because of the work of Hazel in the late 1990s. We got a Robert Wood Johnson grant, a $500,000 Robert Wood Johnson grant, to start to cobble together this whole grassroots advocacy movement. And wow, 11 years later, Pat Taylor is the executive director, and we have chapters and activities all over the country. Carol, you're the former chair of the board. I'm one of the founding members of the board, though I've moved on now. And Faces and Voices of Recovery is taking this message back into communities in front of federal and state policymakers, CEOs, and community leaders, and saying, you know what? Addiction does not discriminate. Treatment works. Recovery is possible. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. I close by telling you this. I've been in remission from my disease for 16 years now. I've had to work very hard at it, a day at a time, no pun intended. I haven't had the obsession or the craving to take a drink or a drug since the morning of October the 12th of 94, but I do know that my disease is cunning, baffling, and powerful, patient. And so I have to work hard at it. I don't get much credit for it. I just show up and do what I'm told. Kind of novel. And it works. It doesn't work all the time and always perfectly, but you know what? Recovery is possible. And I know this to be true because since I wrote this book, and Bill, I shared it when you and I were out in Oregon for the opening of one of Hazelden's facilities out there, I shared that part of my story, the story called Beyond Broken, the rest of the story. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but I will tell you this, and Mary, you know it. The last 5 years of my sobriety have been the toughest 5 years of my entire life. Toughest 5 years of my whole life. And I've hit bottom again. Only this time I've hit bottom sober. And I always thought that hitting bottom in a crack house or in a bar was hard. That's easy because I was under the influence. In the last 5 years, I've had to hit bottom stone cold sober. Ouch. Ouch. But I've stayed sober and I've stayed the course. I've stayed sober because of my recovery program, and I've stayed relatively sane because of the support of people who are in this room today and others. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't trade my life for anything. As hard as it's been, I'm alive. I have the ability to be a single parent to my 3 engaged teenagers. I get to work in the addictions treatment field and to help addicts and alcoholics who have far less than I had when at the bottom. And I get to be with you today. And when I'm with a group of people like you today, you know, I'm going to get on a plane this afternoon and fly back to Minneapolis, where I live in St. Paul. And I'm going to go back. Yes, I have the chronic disease of addiction, but I'm going to go back with more gratitude than when I came here. And what I have discovered in my own life as a recovering addict and an alcoholic is that when I have a high level of gratitude, I also have a high level of humility. And it is that humility that keeps me grounded. And it is that humility that makes me grateful to all of you today. Thank you very much. So I know it's the lunch hour and a lot of people have to get back to work, and it's also very warm in here, but I will take some questions, and I've been told that I have to repeat my the question so that we can get it for the benefit of those who aren't here. Yes, ma'am, you're first, and we'll come to you.
I'm here because I'm Barbara Tinham. I'm a Mexican specialist, and your illness is destroying Mexico. Since 2006, almost 30,000 people have died in Mexico because of the so-called drug wars. And obviously, the solution, or at least part of the solution to this, is dealing with the
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what you think would be some of the ways that we can go about helping to fix this problem?
Sure. The question is, what do we do about the drug war? And you know, I'm biased. I think, unfortunately, and Carol, correct me if I misspeak here, way too many of the federal government's resources are still oriented towards interdiction and tough law enforcement. Not that that's not important, but not enough of those resources under President Obama, just like under President Bush, just like under President Clinton. Not enough of those resources are being focused on the demand. You see, I'm not sure that we have an answer for what's happening in Mexico, but I know one way to reduce the best way to reduce the drug war is to reduce the demand of those who want those drugs, me. I mean, I haven't demanded an illegal or illegal substance for 16 years. Treatment worked. And I think what we need to do is to reorient or better balance, if you will, the federal and the state monies that are being spent on the drug war and put them more into drug courts and diversion programs and treatment programs behind bars. Because addiction is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And simply locking people up, as I wrote about, is not going to solve the problem if we don't also treat those people and give them resiliency so that when they get back out, as most prisoners do, they're back into the world and not demanding those substances. Other than that, I don't really know what to say. I mean, America's been fighting a war on drugs for 200 years. And it really has largely not worked, in part because it's not balanced. Yes?
I hate it when somebody hitchhikes on somebody else's train, but like you said, not enough to stand up. I'm Rob Fleming, and I'm a centurion in the local detachment of the Legions of Advocates. It's called the DC Recovery Community Alliance. And we had our ball game Sunday, we had our rally a week ago, Saturday, and we're continuing other activities in the area. And I'd just like to say, if anybody wants to join that Legion, it's sort of the local version of Faces and Voices, please come see me afterwards.
Thanks, Rob.
Stay for all the questions.
Yeah, you've been a tireless trooper for many, many years. Thanks for coming. Yes, at the back.
My question is about
Treatment.
treatment. Many people quit on their own,
Yeah.
and I remember reading an article, in fact, it was an article by George W. Bush, who quit drinking on his 40th birthday,
Yes.
and I guess hasn't had a drink since. And the article referred to him as an untreated alcoholic.
Uh-huh.
And I'm wondering, what do you and Hazelden think about that, this concept of being an untreated alcoholic?
What's the concept of being an untreated alcoholic who's in recovery is what you mean. There are lots of untreated alcoholics around, and they're drinking. You're talking about sober untreated alcoholics. Yes. Well, you know, President Bush, he quit on his 40th birthday. Of course, he was on his knees with Billy Graham. He had some divine inspiration, I think, in that. Look, I would never take issue with anybody's modality of quitting, modality of recovery, as long as the person who needs help is being treated with dignity and respect. I don't mean just in a treatment way, but in a humanistic way. I think any program of recovery is fine, as long as the acting alcoholic is treated with dignity and respect. I was with President Bush in a rose garden back in 2000. I've told the story 100 times, sorry for those who've heard it. But I remember seeing President Bush in the White House in the rose garden when he was introducing his new drug czar. And I went up to him afterwards. I said, Mr. President, my name is William Moyers. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm a person in recovery. This is before 9/11, and you know, President Bush, without batting an eye and unrehearsed, came right up to me and he said, shook my hand and he said, it sounds like we have something in common. Yeah. And I know, I was born in Texas and he was not, so we don't have that in common. I know who he voted for in the election of 2000. We don't have that in common. So what else could he be talking about? We both recovered from a desperate condition of too much drinking, and in my case, drugging. I'm not sure he was doing any of that drugging. Some people say he was. But the fact of the matter is he recovered. He recovered. And how he did it is fine. Some people talk about spontaneous remission. Others, like me, it's a long process. It doesn't really matter as long as we go back to being taxpayers, engaged parents, public servants, property owners, you know, and all those things. Hazelden's attitude is that just get it, whatever it is. Just get it. Outpatient, church, long-term residential care, what I got, insurance coverage, 12-step meetings, it doesn't really matter as long as it's dignity and respect. Yes.
Hi, William. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise.
Tara Handren.
Hi, Tara.
And I'm a resident of Washington, D.C. And, just to address your point of, you mentioned people coming out and talking. And what I would say in this realm is that I am in recovery. And like you, I was a nice girl from Westchester. It's like certain things weren't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to end up in certain places. But I get what you're saying. Yeah, it doesn't matter the circumstances, and also even if you grow up with certain negative circumstances,
Yeah.
like divorced parents doesn't excuse the way
Mhm.
I drank. It doesn't, like the
Mhm.
whole, the mental obsession, the physical allergy to alcohol has nothing to do with those circumstances. And I'll get to my question. What I did, because it ties in, I do believe there is a difference between us coming out and talking about recovery and a certain 12-step organization
Right.
and my membership in that organization.
Yes.
Two totally separate things.
Absolutely.
I believe. I'm not a poster girl for that.
Right.
But I can stand up in my workplace, or I can show up in my workplace and be responsible, and through my actions be carrying the message of recovery.
Mhm.
And I believe that it comes in all these different forms. Like, you get to write books and you get to talk to people, and you have the gift of doing that. And I know a friend of mine, learned about recovery through her hairdresser. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So something as subtle as like, hey, you reek of alcohol every time you come in when I
Right.
cut your hair. Is there a problem there? So I think as a community, like you said, there isn't one way to do this.
Right.
There's so many different ways, and that I don't have to break the tradition of a certain organization that started in 1935 and is doing just fine without my
Mhm.
advocacy, but still be a member of this community and be able, where appropriate, say I'm a member,
Right.
and where to not go that direction. And I appreciate what you talked about in terms of just the ugliness of this illness. I mean, cancer doesn't piss people off the way alcoholism
Mhm.
pissed off my parents. It didn't disgust them. Like, my mother wasn't disgusted by her mother's breast cancer. I mean, it made her angry, but she didn't know what to do with me. So I think that's one of the things that, how do we get past that? How do we get past the ugliness so that people do want to help addicts and alcoholics? And how do we continue to spread awareness? Because I think so much of the stigma, the misunderstanding comes back to the people that you walked past as you were leaving that room. It may not be just because they didn't have people love them,
Right.
but the messages were not getting to people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess I put that out there to you, to this community. How do we continue to do that? And
Yeah.
it's at all different levels.
We keep talking about it like we are, and listen, I help families every day. 90% of the inquiries I get by email or phone call or by letter from people that I never meet and never will see again, and I try to help them. But what I always tell, particularly family members who are struggling with a loved one, I say, it's okay to hate the illness, but just keep loving the person who has it. Don't enable them, but don't let them go either, because it's never too late. The only thing short of, it's only too late when the person is dead. Now, that's easier said than done when you've got resources in your pocket and you've got some resiliency, but like my family did, but it's never too late. And to talk about it like we're talking about today, I think is vitally important, and to recognize that there is a behavioral component to addiction, like there isn't for cancer. I don't think anyone's ever been shot in a drive-by shooting over insulin. I mean, there are diabetics aren't, robbing banks to get their fix. Cancer patients are not driving down the road irresponsibly necessarily because they're cancer patients. There is a behavioral component to addiction that makes it a hateful illness. But the way to deal with it is what we've done here today. I mean, I think what's happened in the library, this is the greatest public service probably that's happening in Washington today. Because we're educating you all, and you all are going to go back in a few minutes. You're going to leave here and you're going to go back into your respective offices, your communities, and your homes. And I hope that you'll go back with just a little bit more understanding and appreciation for what we've been talking about today. And if you do, then this would have been a great day. Yes?
So help me with the education here for a second.
Help you with the education.
So my mom died of cirrhosis. My brother-in-law
Yep.
was going to probably
Yep.
die shortly because of it. They're all working for it. None of them ever had insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't have insurance, they never look at treatment as being an option.
Right.
Does the Obama health care program give families like mine hope that somewhere, some
Carol, can you come up here for 1 second? Does healthcare reform, the Obama plan, does it give families like yours hope who don't have the resources that they can receive treatment under healthcare reform? Carol, why don't you talk about, she's the expert.
Yeah, in 2014, people who, the Obama administration's healthcare reform benefits will come in effect, and states will start having exchanges where healthcare benefits will be delivered, and it will be a mandatory requirement that addiction benefits will be covered. And we're designing what the benefit will look like, but based on
For all uninsured people in the United States.
that will have both Medicaid and the state exchanges, which will have both employed and small employer and individual policies. Certain large employer plans will be exempt, but those are mostly already have some type of coverage today. So Medicaid, small employer, and individual plans will have mandatory addiction coverage in 2014. So you've got probably a 70 to 90% chance that they'll be covered. Certain large plans will not, but but about 93% of large employers have addiction coverage. So you've got a pretty good shot that they'll be covered.
Well, thank you, Carol. The harsh reality too, and I know we need to wrap it up here, and if anyone needs to go ahead and get up, feel free to do that. The harsh reality is that no matter what, addiction is going to be at the far end of the spectrum in the healthcare continuum, and not just because of government policy, but public perception. There was a piece out this week in Join Together Online about the fact that more Americans more people understand that depression and addiction are illnesses that have origins in the brain. There's a greater understanding of that now than it was 10 years ago. But the stigma around people who have those illnesses is, for all intents and purposes, as strong as it's ever been. And that's been true since the Continental Congress convened back in the 1700s. And so at the end of the day, what I try to do in my work, I recognize that a baseball game, at the Washington Nationals baseball game where Rob was, or where I'll be at the Twins game on Thursday night, and other events, those are great, but at the end of the day, it's one person helping another with this illness. Because if it's not us, who is it going to be? And as you talked about it in your own family, it's so important that families be willing to talk about addiction like they do any other illness that has affected them because of the genetic predisposition. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment.
You want to make a comment? I want to repeat it. Okay.
On my 10-year anniversary.
On your 10-year anniversary in recovery? Thank you for sharing.
My youngest son asked me, he wanted to go get a tattoo commemorating it.
You want to get a tattoo commemorating your 10-year anniversary? Wow. With the date.
With the date.
Yeah.
And he goes, I have to ask you this because people are going to come up to me and ask me what this is.
What this is. People are going to ask him. Yeah.
And he says, I want to make sure it's okay with you.
Yeah.
So we went as a family and we all got tattoos.
And you got tattoos. Is that yours down? I saw that earlier. Wow, that's impressive. Oh, yeah.
28th of February.
Well, so there are some Hazelden alums here as well. I knew there were going to be some here, and you're one of them. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, I don't recommend that everybody get a tattoo, but it's a good point. Yeah, it's a willingness. It's about being open. It's not, I don't wear it on, well, actually, I do wear it on my sleeve in the sense that I am a public advocate for a large treatment center that's been around since 1949. It's what I do. But, I'm not asking people to march in the streets every day or to wear tattooed on their heads. But let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. It's okay. Because you know what? The generations do follow. I talk about it with my own children in a way that tells them that not only do they have, even though my wife and I are now divorced, my children are the products of two alcoholics. So science is telling us that my children are 10 to 20 to 30 times more likely to be addicted than their peers at school in St. Paul because they are the product of two. I better be talking about it. Not just the problem, but I better be talking about the solution with them as well. And that one of the things I say to my children is, if you choose to use, you may not be able to choose the outcome. But the last thing I leave them with is, if you choose to use, you may not develop a problem, or you may develop all kinds of problems. And if that happens, it is okay to ask for help. This is a disease that convinces us we don't need the help or are terrified to ask for it, like no other illness I have ever known. And part of the community dialogue has to be about encouraging the next generation to ask for help. Yes, you had a question.
Yeah, could you say a little
little more about depression?
Depression?
And how it interacts with
Oh, yes.
the treatment that.
Yes.
You're saying that addiction and recovery are treatable, can
Yeah.
be overcome. Depression drugs aren't that great, as I understand.
Yeah. So depression, treatment of depression, I'm not the expert in this, I'll tell you this. When I went to treatment at Hazelden in 1989, the first time, 8% of our patients showed up at the front door with what we call a co-occurring disorder. Depression, bipolar disorder, eating disorder, and addiction. Today it's 80%. Now that's in part due to the fact we're better at diagnosing it. But it's also due to the fact that the world is changing. We've been through a couple of wars. Kids are using it at younger ages. There are a lot of complexities. We find that if you don't treat the fire in the addict and to treat the fire in the belly at the same time, then you're going to be all for naught. And so we are very good at treating what we call the co-occurring disorders of addiction and other mental illnesses. Support groups are one way to do that, or one component of that. Taking drugs, legally prescribed drugs is another one. Zoloft and Prozac and others that are coming onto the market. But we know that you've got to treat both. But there's no cure yet. And so it's a process. It's a process.
I'm thinking that if the drugs,
Yep.
if the drugs to treat the depression, bipolar, or whatever, aren't really all that successful or there yet,
Some are pretty good.
hope for the addiction.
Some are pretty good. Yeah, some are pretty good. We're going to have to wrap it up here. We'll take one more question and then we're going to be gone.
Would you speak to the role of the family?
Speak to the role of the family. Yep.
With, in relation to the person who is not in recovery,
Yep.
active in their disease.
So what do you do if you're a mother or a grandmother who's got a family member who is active in their disease? What do you do? Well, you set strong boundaries. You can't make that person stop. You can't compel that person to stop. But what you must do until that person either stops or moves on in your life is to take care of yourself. That's really, really hard for some of us. I'm much better at taking care of other people than I am at taking care of myself. I've had to learn that big time in the last 5 years especially, which is why I go to another 12-step group that has nothing to do with my drinking, but has everything to do with my thinking. And my thinking of controlling other people. And so you need to set boundaries. You need to say to that loved one, if that's who you're talking about, I love you, but I can't tolerate your behavior. I want to help you, but only if you're willing to get help. And in the meantime, I'm not going to allow you to be in my house as an active using person because it's illegal and disruptive and unhealthy for everybody involved. Take care of yourself, but never let go of that person. Keep that door open. Keep that hand out. Don't let that person pull you down, but always have that hand ready to help pull that person up. Always remind that person that you love them, even while you may hate what the illness is doing to everybody. And remember, it's never too late. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.